as far as our One Canoe vision, which is guiding us, as we reflect on the mission for the DEI committee and for the Red Cross in general, this One Canoe vision, which hopefully you've all had a chance to review, is a powerful one, and that is because it binds us together and suggests the undeniable fact that we're all in this together, and we have the opportunity to collaborate, to paddle together on this journey together. And importantly, and as Susie had suggested, we can't afford to not do so. We're spread out geographically. We share the brunt of the climate and the energy crises, and we share so many of the same socio-economic challenges. We have to paddle together. And I hope that we have the opportunity to learn and embrace this vision. Today, we have four fabulous leaders, all a part of or representing the region's DEI committee. They will help us understand the nature of their respective communities, the strategies that allow us to better connect with them, and suggestions on how we, the Red Cross, can do can leverage this insight to better our service delivery. So I'd like to introduce our leaders. First is Renise Bain. Renise is a longtime Red Cross volunteer, Red Cross disaster volunteer. She is the disaster direct services lead for the Pacific Islands region and community education presenter. She's also emergency management staff officer for plants and operations for the Honolulu Department of Emergency Management. She's on our DEI committee. Welcome, Renise. Next is James Faumina. He's been a member of the American Samoa Red Cross since 2012 and also sits on our DEI committee. He is Chief Compliance Officer with the Department of Homeland Security, a former Deputy Director of Human Resources for the American Samoan government, and a U.S. Army veteran with a Bronze Star. Thanks for your service, James. And we also have Carvin Flynn. Carvin is American Red Cross Guam board member as well as treasurer. And he's been with the Red Cross for about 5 years now and a partner with Scott Magliari and Company. And lastly, we're also honored to have Dr. Bobby Cruz, who's stepping in for our representative for Northern Marianas, Tana Bellew Camacho. Dr. Cruz identifies with he, him pronouns and is a proud Chamorro who openly identifies as gay and is passionate about coalition building to create braver, safer, and more inclusive spaces. He is the director for instructional technology and distance education and the co-director for mental health in the island's public school system. Dr. Cruz serves as co-chair for the board of the American Red Cross Marianas chapter. Welcome, team. So I'd like to start with a question regarding the situation. That'll help us understand the situation on the ground where you serve. So we'll just go around the room. I'll pose a question, and this is going to be very casual, and I invite you to respond to each other's responses as well. So the question is, can you share the nature of the diversity that can be found in your communities and any of the challenges that these differences bring? Carvin, do you want to start?
Sure, I'll go ahead and start. Thanks, Noel, for hosting this, and welcome to all the other members, Renise, James, and Bobby. It is a pleasure and an honor to be among you. You guys are very diverse and very well involved with American Red Cross. I would just like to add, Noel, that I've been with Red Cross for over about 12 years now.
Sorry about
so
that.
yeah, but time flies when you're having fun, right? The first question that you asked is the nature and the diversity within our respective communities. Guam has a very robust and dynamic and broad diversity group of different cultures, different ethnic groups, and it blends really well. And there's a lot of homogeneity in terms of just coming together as Guam. But what we find is that there are still social and economic challenges in that diversity. And that's the challenge that we face, trying to bridge that gap in a lot of ways. But I think that in our community, I think that it is possible to be able to reach out to those, but we have to make those efforts to do so because of the social and economic challenges. And when you look at Guam, we have people from the Federated States of Micronesia, from the Republic of Palau, people from the Marshall Islands, Samoa, uh, uh, Chuk, Pohnpei, so and plus Japanese, Chinese, Korean, Vietnamese, Americans, and then you break that down into various ethnic groups. So it's very broad and diverse. So the challenge is, how do you bring all of that together so we are paddling together? And that's the challenge that we are facing. And I think I may be going in some of the other questions, is that I think it's trying to find some commonality. And we do have that with respect to Guam, but then we kind of tend to go back to our respective groups at times. And that challenge is bridging that gap from those who are economically, who have benefited financially, and those who are still kind of at the lower levels of the economic change, so to speak. And oftentimes there's a disconnect because it's not, um, there's just a disconnect from a standpoint of trying to reach out to those communities because they feel somehow isolated. And I think that tends to happen in some of the areas where people are not making that much money, and they're not that well, um, they're not in a well financial position, and so they tend to retreat. And also some of the other barriers that may exist is because of the language. Um, some people come from the outer islands, so to speak, and so they may not be that well versed in English, which is the common language that we speak. And so they're a lot more comfortable speaking their language, but they feel like they don't have a voice because they're a little shy in communicating certain things because they don't have a great command of the English language. But who does? Uh, when you think about it, none of us really have a strong command of the English language, but it's just trying to find a way to do that. And I think that's some of the nature of our community that we have, and is trying to find a way to bridge all that together so that we can collectively move forward. And as you said, Noel, paddle together.
Thank you, Carvin.
Okay.
So I heard themes around just a very diverse community within just this area, right? Within Guam. There's also diversity in terms of socioeconomic levels, and then there are also language differences or
Yes.
challenges or
Mhm.
opportunities.
And
Yeah,
cultural as well too. Even though Guam, we have the Chamorro culture, but we still have our respective cultures within the society of Guam. Is because, as I mentioned, we have these various ethnic groups who would like to retain their culture, which is a good thing. But we still have that diversity within the culture. So we see how it's separated into those little subgroups, so to speak, because there's comfort in that group. So how do you bridge that to bring it together so that everyone can feel inclusive?
thank you.
You're welcome.
Would who would like to add? James? Oh,
Go ahead,
Can you hear me?
Bernice.
yes.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me here as part of the panel. And I don't know about James and Bobby, but I'm so glad Carvin started. Kind- he kind of covered all the bases. He, it sounded like Carvin's community was all within the islands around the Asia side. And so with Hawaii, we've been tagged as the melting pot. So we also include Europe and South America and the other continents that also come to Hawaii. So, we add to this pot of diversity. And we also have the social economical challenges as well, the language. And I think what, thank goodness for technology, it's allowed us to kind of start expanding on the communication, so that we can understand each other. We can, put some information in print of the specific languages of the different communities that we need to convey messages to. So yeah, we have the same exact challenges, as well as I'm pretty sure we're all tied into some way of being creative to communicate. And communication is really big, because once we get that, once we bridge that, we're able to get onto that canoe and paddle in one direction.
Thanks, Bernice.
Yeah, and if I can just jump in here, it is, first say Hafaday, Tirawami, and aloha to everyone. As I was listening to, Carvin share, I was, wanting to add sort of a deeper conversation about how I think that there really is a social cultural phenomenon of smallness, of remoteness, of being marginalized. And I feel that that phenomenon of feeling like we're not quite up to par with those in the mainland US, I think that that applies actually to many of the diverse cultural groups that are a part of this Pacific Islander community. And so, we have a very, very diverse population. We have, we have our Chinese, Koreans, Japanese. We have folks from Bangladesh, and then we have, of course, our indigenous population. But there's this phenomenon as an educator that I'm seeing that's prevalent in our parents and in our kids, where our kids feel that because we're so remotely located, we're so small, nobody, necessarily knows where we are. Our context of being from the NMI always is built upon where Guam is at. And then so we sort of start from Guam, and then we sort of then tell folks here we are. And so people feel small. And so when we have folks who are coming in from the outside, from the mainland, who want to provide these services, it's a clashing of culture almost, because we are not able to feel vulnerable, because we see folks, they're very well intentioned. They're here to offer their heart, to offer their hands, and unfortunately, the population can't get outside of their own cultural context. And so, how do we communicate with individuals from our island community in ways that allow them to feel vulnerable enough, safe enough to avail of these services? And I think that's a very important conversation. In order for us to advance the work of, the humanitarian life-giving work, we have to ask ourselves, how do we how do we take into account the cultural context of the different groups within these Pacific Islander communities, and say, how do I adjust my tone? What are their beliefs and values? What does respeto mean? What does reciprocity mean? Even in terms of our gestures, right? How do we speak their language so that we say, without saying it, I see you, you're visible, your context and your history matters to me. And I think for Guam and for the entire Marianas, and, for many of our Pacific Islander entities, we come from, there's a lot of historical trauma. We come from many colonial powers moving in and moving out. And I think that that social phenomena of feeling small, that remoteness, feeling like we're lesser than, I feel like that, also is related to our history. And I think that if we're really going to provide these services and support many of our disenfranchised and marginalized communities, we have to think about what it means to be more culturally conscientious. And I would say that it means thinking about our own context, taking ourselves outside of our own biases, and asking ourselves, what are the cultural beliefs, tenets, and values that are unique to these people? And let's try to speak their language. Let's try to walk like they walk. Let's try to talk like they talk. Let's show them that we appreciate their history. So I just wanted to, we reflect a very similar population. And I just wanted to add that there's also this other social phenomenon that I think still exists. And so a part of this humanitarian work is, how do we change the mindset of our people so that they feel that they're just as capable, right? How do we make them feel comfortable enough to avail of these life-saving services?
Bobby, I think you touched on some very important points when you talk about the clashes of cultures. And because we have a lot of well-intended and well-intentioned individuals who come from the outside into the various communities that we live in, but they lack the cultural understanding. And, they may be well-intended, but if they don't take the time to really walk along that person to get to know that individual or that cultural group, there is a disconnect. And there is that marginalization that people will exist because, and it's something that's been passed down through the years, going back as far as the TT days and prior to that, right? And that sense of not I don't want to say the word subservient, but the lesser of, so to speak, because you had a lot of, and let's face it, we've all been influenced by the United States of America and that culture coming in and that mindset coming in, and it's not superior, but how they interact gives a sense of superiority or looking down and talking to someone as opposed to coming alongside and talking with. And that is a big important part. And I think we still see some of that in various parts of people coming in from outside communities. And again, well-intentioned, but they don't understand the cultures and they come in with those implicit biases and those things tend to permeate and sometimes it's unspoken, but it is spoken by the way you interact with individuals. And oftentimes the reaction to that is to feel or to disengage or to pull back and not necessarily get involved or feel like, well, this person's talking down to me as opposed to talking with me and to me and coming alongside of me. So that communication aspect and that lack of understanding and this clash of cultures, that's something that has to be addressed. I mean, I think we've all felt that living in the islands. I mean, I've been out in Micronesia for over, well, since 1970s. That's how long I've been out here. And I've seen this, I've seen it, and I continue to see a lot of these things, these biases that come in here, and in how it impacts the various cultures that we have within our communities. And then it happens within the community itself, because, for example, I don't want to generalize, but oftentimes some people will say they will refer to people from Chuuk, Pohnpei, Yap, and other islands as the Micronesians. And that's in itself is a bias because these are cultural groups within themselves that has an identity. It could be from the Western Carolina Islands, it could be from Samoa, it could be from the various islands, but each of those are very diverse and very different. So, and that is an implicit bias when you see people simply refer to, oh, it's the Micronesians. And oftentimes people don't realize that biases that they're portraying and communicating, but how it's received is to put people in a box and say, well, you're putting me in a box and characterizing me as this group, when in fact I have a unique culture of my own.
Thank you both.
Yeah, Carvin Carvin has a point. Sorry, Carvin has a point. Just to kind of piggyback before it's got to be James's turn. It's not just using those cultural languages, but it's also when as a disaster responder, when we have visitors come, their intentions are to lend of their free time to help and assist us with the recovery efforts. Without that cultural knowledge, we have visitors that arrive and then they use the words, "We're here to take over." Now, that in itself is language that is completely offensive, even though they didn't mean to. But those are the types of education and cultural awareness that we need to lead and alert all of our visitors on being very careful with those types of words. And it's not just within the cultures; it's with our visitors and helping them to be able to be successful in helping us to recover. So James, you're on.
Thanks, Reese. And I'll be brief. I think we come at this through the lens of our own experiences. And I appreciate Carvin kicking us off, and Renice and Bobby made some good points through the lens of their own perspectives of their home countries. And Carvin had mentioned implicit bias. And I think that's the connotation. If we've ever met our brothers and sisters from neighboring Samoa, there is that implicit bias because we identify ourselves as American Samoa rather than Samoa independent state. So that has sort of undertones of implicit bias when we do engage, but we're trying to get away from that. And then the other side of the sword, some of the American Samoa family have it as a point of pride, right? There you have Chinese Americans, you have African Americans, you have Italian Americans, but they say that this is the only ethnic group that starts off with American instead of their identity. So instead of Samoan American, there's American Samoa. So, but for here, for our own island, I think there's been we've been at a crossroad in the last 8 to 12 years. Unlike our other brothers and sisters, we manage our own border security and our immigration laws. So as the tuna industry in the 60s and 70s had peaked, we brought in a lot of skilled labor from Southeast Asia. And a lot of those families stayed and settled roots. And now now their children have returned from college. They have the right to vote. They have the right to engage in civil activity. And that's the representation that's now being at the forefront. They were given their past experiences of fear that they might be retaliated against. The offspring are now taking an aggressive approach in their civil liberties, so to speak. And I speak primarily for the Chamber of Commerce as an example. It was always a circle of maybe 10, 12 businesses that were primarily American Samoans. But 80% of our commerce are dominated by Asians. And now they're coming to the forefront. Now they're doing, instead of leading on cash business, now they're using our banks. Now they're keeping the money locally. Now they're developing infrastructure because their children have settled roots. So the question comes is, how do we bring them into our sphere's influence as far as services, right? And we make it a point of emphasis to make sure they're not marginalized. And every engagement we have, there is a representation or a seat on the canoe, for lack of a better metaphor, as we speak here this afternoon. So kudos, there's a lot of good engagement here, but how can we all dance to the beat of one drum for a deep blue Pacific, as we call it, for a safer engagement? I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, James. So and we'll make some time for questions. I'm pretty sure that our audience here will have some questions for you. It's very clear that even within within one island, for example, that there are so many differences, right? We talked about languages, cultures, norms, things that are very obvious, and also things that are not too obvious, Bobby, as you've described earlier. So one obvious question would be, or maybe not too obvious question would be, as a visitor coming into our spaces, specifically an individual is delivering service, like Red Cross volunteer as an example, how do we ensure that we can minimize the conflicts, right, that can come from not understanding the differences or not having the cultural competency? So how have you dealt with, given your experiences there, how have you dealt with these situations where people come in and you want to ensure that they're successful and be able to, interact and engage with the local communities? Interested in hearing what you have seen done successfully and maybe what you've done in particular.
Yeah, well, if I can just jump in here, and if I can just, speak in Chamorro for just a second. There's a phrase, it's Gof importante na tababa I corazonta dani hinasota zata ekunguk I istorya ni tautau siha, especiat I tautau siha ti na timan pareho na hanengi, which means that we have to open up our heart, open up our mind, and really listen to the stories of others, especially those who are differently positioned than we are. And so I think that the work of any humanitarian organization, especially the Red Cross that has this amazing global reach, right, is that when we reach into different communities, we think about what they value. And so for lack of a better term, it's really thinking about what it means to be a responsible outsider. And I think it goes back to exploring your own implicit biases and asking yourself, what can I do to alter my behavior in such a way that allows the indigenous population, the various diverse groups that exist within a demographic, to be receptive to what I have to say. People are not going to be able to avail of these life-giving services, you know, effectively if they aren't, you know, if they don't feel safe. So I think that a part of this conversation about inclusion and diversity really revolves around creating the psychological safety necessary for folks to be able to receive these services. I mean, so in terms of strategies, right? I haven't been a part of the Red Cross for very long. I've been told that this is a safe space, and I love working with my team out here in the Marianas, and so I'm just going to go for it. But I don't know if you all already have standards, so please, Tana will probably kill me if if I might be overstepping here. But you know, in the world of mental health, we have what's called the culturally and linguistically diverse standards, and so there's a standard of care that all mental health providers, all clinicians must adhere to. And a part of these standards, you know, are really all about what I just described. It's understanding that the context of that person it's imperative, it's sacrosanct to them being able to receive the different therapies that you have, the different interventions. And I think the humanitarian work that we do is a type of intervention. So we're intervening to save lives, at which you know it's the highest calling. And again, I just want to reiterate that, you know, if we think about a set of standards that help us contend with our own implicit biases, consider the, you know, how we can make language more accessible. Consider the fact that, you know, if you're serving here in the CNMI, that we have a, you know, a huge population who are English language learners. We also have folks whose English is their first language, but they don't necessarily feel, if you come in here with a standard American accent, sometimes that can trigger the subservience that Carvin was talking about. So they may not be as receptive. So, you know, there's different layers. So how do we use language, not just you know, the different forms of language, but different applications of tone and inflection and indigenous phrases, and also indigenous principles and values, and you know, really study that. And then as we engage with folks, I think, you know, to be open about it, say, hey, you know, as Pacific Islanders, I know you all value respect to you, respect. You all value tintuli, which means reciprocity, and saying, hey, you know, I'm here. I'm here to walk along with you. I'm here to give and also to receive. So I don't want to ramble on too long, give space for others, but you know, just my little tidbit. And so, you know, when I engage with folks, we give a lot of contracts to folks from the mainland US. And one of the things that I believe I'm responsible for in my leadership capacity is saying, listen, as you provide services to our people, how do you make sure that you do so in ways that are culturally conscientious? So what I just described is a conversation that I always have. Being culturally competent, culturally conscientious is a major factor of discussion and consideration before we provide any kind of service.
Bobby, I totally agree with you on that, and that's very important for providing our services, particularly when we have people coming from outside communities. And you mentioned respect to, that's very important because you come in with, as we've mentioned before, these implicit biases, but with the well-intentioned and to help. But you come in, you're not being respectful to the culture and to the people and coming alongside them and understanding the culture. I mean, before you can really provide a service, you need to understand who you're dealing with and understand the culture. And I think that approach can be taken in anything that we do. You can't tackle a task until you understand what the task is and who you're dealing with and what you're trying to accomplish. And the easy way to be able to do that is to make sure that you understand the culture and the people and what their values are, and then be able to come down to that level. Even though you may have a stronger command of the English language, you may have to throw in some words in the native tongue so that they can see that you're reaching out to try and communicate to them at their various levels. And I think each of us probably knows various small little phrases and things like that in the various languages, but that's how we communicate with each other. Because the best way of communication is communicate in such a way that that person understands it, and in such a way that that person knows that you are trying to communicate with them as opposed to talk down to them. And I think that's a challenge coming into our communities to provide these levels of service, particularly when you have the social and economic challenges and you throw in that language barrier and that implicit bias. And again, I keep going back to that implicit bias because oftentimes people are totally unaware. I hate to use the phrase ignorant, well, it just means that they're not knowledgeable, right? They're not aware of these things and these various cultures. And they come in and they want to take charge and provide the service, but there's apprehension because you're not communicating in such a way that I feel safe or I feel comfortable to really receive those services. And then there was something else that was mentioned about having a seat at the table. I think, James, you mentioned something about having a seat at the table. It would be nice to see someone that looks like me, or someone who communicates like me, so that I can see that, this person, I can see myself in that person. This person is representing me, and therefore I can trust this individual, or I can communicate with this individual in such a way that he or she can respond and know what I'm talking about. But when you see someone that's totally different from you coming in with certain biases and certain ways of doing things, which is counterproductive to how you would normally do that, and it's communicated in such a way that there is a disconnect in that communication where there's apprehension. And the services may be there, but the services may not be able to be provided at that level because it's just not communicated in such a way where I feel comfortable to receive those services. I may really need those services, but I just don't feel good about it just because it's not being communicated to me in such a way that I feel comfortable, or it's just a lack of respect. Okay, and that's a challenge. That's going to be something that we always have to be responsible of, to be cognizant of. So I think anyone coming in should take the time to become culturally aware of the environment that they're going into, so that by the time they get there, they have a better understanding of the culture, of the people, and of the things that are value to them, so that when you come in there, it's not coming in from a sense of superiority. It's almost you coming in as a humble individual to come alongside people to help them. And I think that bodes well, and it goes a long way, because pride will really separate you in terms of how you project yourself, but you come in humble and with an understanding, hey, look, I'm trying to help and I want to come alongside of you. Help me to understand your culture. Help me to be able to be respectful of the various nuances and the differences that exist. And I think we would all be receptive to receiving individuals in that capacity as someone coming in with a sense of communicating downward, taking control, and really trying to get their hand on everything and be able to navigate that. But when you bring people in and you learn how to communicate with them in such a way that they understand that you're really being there to help, and they feel that and they hear it and it's communicated in such a way, it's received a lot better. It just simply is. Sorry, guys, I didn't
Marvin.
mean
Yeah,
to.
so
No,
Arvin, so in answer to Noel's question, strategies, using what Bobby and Carvin had said, I'm going to wear my instructor hat, and just kind of throw this out there and say, for the people who are listening to our input, several things to consider when I'm deployed as the disasters operations manager. I'm overseeing all the client-facing activities. Anything that goes out into the field that requires a face-to-face interaction with the client, those activities fall under me. And so, using the lava flow deployment as an example, we had a lot of people coming in from the mainland to help us, and it was really tough trying to wrangle everybody in and bring them back in to remind them, hey, you're on our island, and um, we have some cultural sensitivities to adhere to. One of one example, one strategy I would throw out there is use your five senses, your taste, touch, hear, smell, um, whatever I missed. But so with the hearing part, stop and listen. Like, encourage your workers when they come in. They have to stop. They have to listen. They have to not just listen to the people's stories, but they have to listen to instruction. They have to be. They need to, again, like Carvin said, be open to receive information. And then the language, the mouth. You know, it's watching what comes out of your mouth, and it's also being willing to use um, local languages so that you can show them that you're making an effort to communicate. And seeing is super important, because when you have people coming from the mainland and coming to the islands, you know, we're dealing with some socioeconomical margins here on the islands. And even though you see uncle and he looks disheveled, he may be disheveled because he had just suffered a disaster, but his disheveledness does not implicate that he is, you know, lacking in language, lacking in education. He could be one of our kupuna. He could be a family patriarch, a chief. He could hold a high position, but it's because of the visual,
Mhm.
you know, aesthetics of what he may appear to be like. It's one of those things that, you know, people that come in with their own personal biases may just make this instant judgment, and then, you know, inadvertently disrespect our kupuna. So I would encourage people to be creative with using a standard. Like, there's a lot of information we're throwing at you, but if you can just use a standard of maybe using your five senses, label what those five senses mean. And it's much easier to use five senses because that's universal. Everybody remembers that. And what each of the senses you want to bring out and forward to help people to make that connection with our community. And then the last thing is trusting the local intel, trusting local knowledge. Many times when we have these relief operations, when people come in from the mainland, it all starts to turn and turn, where management and the administrators and the people who are making the decisions sort of starts to be more people from the mainland rather than your local talent and your local resources. So I would really encourage our workforce staffing committees, or activities to, you know, encourage an orientation, have a video that is required when you come in to check in and I'll do your onboarding for your deployment. It's got to be a requirement to watch a video that pertains to that local community that you're coming to, so that you can be aware of the language, the culture, the simple basic stuff that people just needs to be aware of, that is most important. Not getting into the weeds, but just a generalization of what is important to our culture, just to kind of help bridge them. I mean, we kind of do this whole like immersion thing, you know, in days because we have a disaster to attend to, but something to the point where it needs to be required. And it's not just for volunteers. It has to be for staff as well, paid staff that come in. They have a completely different mindset when they come in, and there's like this, they're on a different wheelhouse, so to speak. And so they need to actually get into that canoe. They're not running alongside the canoe. They're not in that boat with the motor, you know, following alongside the canoe. They're in the canoe. They need to understand that they're holding that paddle and they got to paddle with the rest of the
Yes.
group. They're not leading, so they have to be included, paid staff as well as the other employees. So anyway, that was my 2 cents.
So if I
Okay.
may, so I'll just piggyback on Renice. Um, as the equivalence of Hawaii Civil Defense for American Samoa, it's an added bonus that I'm Red Cross next to the federal coordinating officer. We have a cultural do's and don'ts presentation. It's about an hour training for all federal partners that are inbound in support of our pandemic. And as much as we gave them death by PowerPoint, we had a partnership with New West out of Washington State, who brought nurses to assist the lack of medical staff. And we gave them the same presentation. And this particular individual arrived on Tuesday, and she got the briefing, and then she went to a beach and did a TikTok that was offensive to the kupuna. And the local governments and leadership found out about it the following day, and she was put back on a plane the following Thursday. So she was on island for less than 72 hours. And all because although she was freedom of speech, there were certain things in that presentation, right? While some people have tolerance, it was offensive to kupuna, like Renice had mentioned, right? So if that's a template we're willing to share with the group. It might be helpful, but it's just a guidelines. Even though there's a lot of tolerance and patience in the Pacific community, we have to be really careful, as Renise had mentioned. So I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think we have until like 10 more minutes, right? 2:10. Yeah. So we'll move into Q&A at this point. I think it's very clear that what the challenges are, as well as what the opportunities are. I think being able to create processes, create practices that allow us to ensure that visiting staff, visiting volunteers don't make these unintended mistakes is key here. And being able to not create instant cultural competency, but being able to create the awareness that you may not know what you don't know, right? And go in with this open mind, the opportunity, and the interest in learning and seeking out the information. I think there's a theme here that I've heard, and I know we can talk even longer, but I'd like to give the opportunity for our audience to get answers to their questions. Does any? Yes. It is. Yes. Yeah. Thanks, Jan. So I just want to share a message of appreciation from one of our board members. Essentially, we're very happy that this session is being recorded, because there's so many lessons here and so many insights that'll be important to share more broadly. So thanks, Dan. Karen, you have a question?
If you can ask James, if you know, would it be possible for us to see the video, sit online that he said they showed?
So, James, there is a question about the orientation video that you shared. That is the do's and don'ts. Is that available? Can that be shared?
James, you have to unmute yourself.
Sorry. It was a collaboration of different partners, and Red Cross had input in it, and the lead folks involved in giving the presentation, we thought it was appropriate, is the U.S. Army Reserve on island. So because a lot of these federal partners, and DOD is also a federal agency, there is a task major, Hana Vauli is the point of contact for those PowerPoint slides, and I'll be sure to make it available to you, Noel, if it helps. So I'll try and send it out tomorrow morning.
Thank you.
The Army Reserve is the face of giving that do and don'ts presentation once our federal teams arrive on island. And the governor, who's also a honorary chair for Red Cross, has a lot of impact in making sure that there's Red Cross representation during disaster response, and making sure these core competencies with respect to engaging the community are adhered to. So I'll make that available to you tomorrow, Noel.
Thank you, James.
So this is Diane. I can't see you, but I just wanted to add that for Karen's question, that the 3 videos that Cindy has shared. Cindy's online here, but we can share those as well. They are the FEMA videos for NMI, Guam, and American Samoa, for folks flying in to do disaster response. I don't have one for Hawaii as far as I know. So Renise has put together some tips and
Any other? I think we have one more question. Anybody? No.
Things like that approach all cultures. Yeah. Number one, take respect. How important asset I think that transcends, I think, all having that approach.
Carvin, there was acknowledgement of your comment about the importance of the essence is essentially humility, right? Going into a space, and with humility, that allows you to be in the right frame of mind, and also achieve the approach that's needed for you to be able to understand, to ask the right questions and integrate. So there
I
is
think that, I was going to make a comment. I think that's so important to show humility, because when you, to me, showing humility, it shows respect. Uh, and it's important to go in there with a humble attitude, because it shows that you're really there to help. You're not really there to take control. And it's not just it's an action. It's not just words, but it's together. Your words and the actions will show that humility within you. And I think we can all appreciate and sense that when a person is really humble to come alongside another individual. And because that, and then that reception that results as a result of that, allows the communication to flow, allows an understanding and to be appreciated, and to go back and forth in that conversation. A humble heart, goes a long way to dealing with people who may have those biases or perceived biases that you coming in to try and take control. Because particularly as people coming in from the mainland, and even within the various cultures ourselves, having a humble attitude goes a long way. It just does.
Thank you, Kevin. Anne Marie,
Okay, this is Anne Marie Matao.
can you hear, by the way?
Can you hear me? Anyway,
Just a little bit.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment that I think Bobby brought up. It's not just the act of receiving help, but it's also giving and acknowledging that gift of giving. For Pacific Islanders, I know where I'm from, Chamorro, it's important to respect that exchange, giving and receiving. So thank you for making.
Thank you, Anne Marie. Okay, I think we're going to wrap up now. We're going to transition to the next activity. And to our panelists, hats off to you. Thank you very much for making time for this activity, for this event. I think the information you've shared, the knowledge that you've shared, are very, very valuable. And you should see the room here. Michelle's actually moving the camera around so you can see who was looking at you. Again, thank you so much.
Thank you as well for the opportunity. Yeah. Thank you, Noel, for hosting. Wonderful job. Bobby, James, Renee, thank you very much.
Take care, guys.
Thank you. Appreciate your
Okay.
time.
You're
Yeah,
welcome.
thank you,
You guys take
everyone.
care.
Zeus Maasi, thank you, Lisao. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.